Forgiveness. It's a word that sounds so simple but rarely feels that way. Sometimes it's whispered like a promise. Other times it echoes like an accusation. What does it mean to forgive? Does it mean forgetting? Does it mean excusing what can't be undone? Or is it something deeper, a path back to yourself, a way to finally stop carrying what never really belonged to you? Every culture has a story about forgiveness. Sometimes it's a tale of redemption, sometimes of loss. Sometimes forgiveness is painted as an act of heroism. Other times, it's the quiet surrender no one sees. But what if, beneath all these stories, forgiveness is actually about your own survival? What if it's not about what happened, but about who you choose to be next? The truth is, forgiveness is never as straightforward as the world would like you to believe. It's tangled up in memory, in fear, in the stubborn hope that someone else might one day see your pain and say the right words. But what happens when that never comes? What happens when you're left alone with wounds that don't heal just because you want them to? Tonight, you'll walk through the landscape of forgiveness, not as a destination, but as a complex, shifting terrain. Because what happens inside you when you forgive, or can't, is the true heart of this story. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find that forgiveness isn't really about the other. It's about your freedom. There's a place inside you where every hurt lives, not the surface wounds that heal with time and tenderness, but the deeper ones, the betrayals that rewrote your understanding of trust, the abandonments that taught you to expect disappearing acts, the cruelties that convinced you that love comes with teeth. These wounds don't exist in isolation. They form patterns, connecting to hurts that came before, creating what feels like an internal map of all the ways the world has failed to hold you safely. Each new pain finds its way to old pain, like water following familiar channels. This inner landscape is more complex than we often realize. Our wounds don't just hurt us, they shape us. They become part of our psychological architecture, influencing how we see ourselves, how we move through relationships, how we interpret the actions of others. Jung called this phenomenon the complex, an autonomous cluster of thoughts, feelings, and memories that operate semi-independently within your psyche. When someone triggers your abandonment complex, you don't just feel hurt by their specific action. You feel the accumulated weight of every time you've been left behind. This is why your reaction to someone's betrayal might feel disproportionate to the actual offense. Your psyche doesn't distinguish between past and present when a complex gets triggered. The pain feels immediate and overwhelming because, to your unconscious mind, it is. Understanding this changes everything about how you approach forgiveness. You're not just forgiving one person for one act. You're working with an entire constellation of wounds, some of which may stretch back generations through your family line. Your inability to just let go isn't weakness. It's your psyche's intelligent recognition that something significant needs to be processed before genuine healing can occur. Your resistance to forgiveness might be protecting you from spiritual bypassing, the tendency to use forgiveness as a way to avoid feeling the full impact of what happened. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to not forgive yet. Sometimes, the healthiest response is to let yourself feel angry a little longer, to honor the part of you that knows something important was violated. The path toward forgiveness begins not with the decision to forgive, but with the willingness to fully inhabit your own experience, to let the wound be as big as it actually is, to feel the rage, the grief, the betrayal, without immediately trying to transcend it. There's something disturbing that happens when you really look at the person who hurt you. If you look long enough, past the anger and the righteousness, You might catch a glimpse of something that makes you deeply uncomfortable. You see yourself, not your innocent self, not your wounded self, but your capacity for the very thing they did to you, your potential for betrayal, for cruelty, for the kind of unconscious harm that leaves lasting scars. This recognition is what depth psychology calls shadow projection, the tendency to see in others the qualities we most fear and reject in ourselves. The person who triggers your deepest rage isn't just someone who hurt you. They're someone who embodies aspects of your own nature that you've spent your life trying to deny. The betrayal that devastates you connects to your own betraying impulses, the times you've been dishonest to protect yourself, the moments you've chosen your comfort over someone else's well-being. The abandonment that breaks your heart links to your own abandoning tendencies, the relationships you've left when they got too complicated. This shadow recognition is one of the most challenging aspects of genuine forgiveness work. It requires you to give up the story that makes you purely innocent and then purely guilty. It asks you to acknowledge that the line between victim and perpetrator is often thinner than we want to admit. This recognition is essential for real healing because projection keeps you psychologically tied to the person who hurt you. As long as you need them to be the container for all the evil in the situation, you remain energetically connected to them. When you take back the projection, when you acknowledge your own capacity for the behavior you condemn, something profound happens. The energy you've been using to maintain the split between good and evil becomes available for healing. This doesn't mean excusing their behavior or minimizing the harm they caused. It means recognizing that they, like you, are a complex mixture of light and darkness, consciousness and unconsciousness. This recognition can be terrifying because it means giving up moral superiority. It means accepting that you're not fundamentally different from the person who hurt you. You're both human beings capable of both love and harm. This terror is necessary. We cannot become whole while maintaining the illusion of our own goodness. We cannot heal while insisting on our own innocence. We cannot forgive while refusing to acknowledge our own capacity for the very behaviors we condemn. When you can see the person who hurt you as fully human rather than as a monster, they lose their power to define you as victim. You reclaim the authority to define yourself as someone who has experienced harm but is not destroyed by it. Ancient alchemists spent lifetimes attempting to transform base metals into gold. This work serves as a profound metaphor for psychological transformation, the process by which our deepest wounds can become sources of wisdom and strength. In psychological terms, your pain is the raw material that, when worked with consciously, can be transformed into something precious. But this transformation doesn't happen automatically. It requires deliberate, patient engagement with difficult material. Real transformation requires what we might call conscious suffering, the ability to feel your pain fully without being destroyed by it, to stay present with difficulty without collapsing into victimhood or hardening into bitterness. This conscious suffering is different from both unconscious wallowing and spiritual bypassing. It's a mature relationship with pain that honors its message without being controlled by it. During this process, you learn to distinguish between clean pain and dirty pain. Clean pain is the natural response to loss, betrayal, or harm. It hurts, but it's clear and purposeful. Dirty pain is what you add to the original wound through resistance, self-blame, or attempts to control what's already happened. Clean pain says, "This hurts because something important was damaged." Dirty pain says, "This shouldn't have happened," or "I should be over this by now." Clean pain moves through you. Dirty pain gets stuck and creates suffering on top of suffering. Understanding begins to emerge from the darkness. You see patterns in your wounding, connections between your current pain and older wounds, insights about how your specific experience relates to universal human themes. This often involves understanding your personal experience in the context of myths and archetypal patterns that have appeared across cultures. You realize that your particular wound is also a universal wound. This doesn't minimize your personal experience, it gives it greater meaning. You're not just healing your own wound, you're participating in an ancient human process of turning suffering into wisdom. Eventually, integration occurs. The wound doesn't disappear, but it's no longer the defining feature of your landscape. It becomes incorporated into a larger wholeness that includes but transcends the original pain. Forgiveness often emerges naturally here. Not because you forced yourself to let go, but because you no longer need the person who hurt you to be different than they were. Your healing no longer depends on their acknowledgement or change. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to transform suffering into meaning, wounds into wisdom. You participate in this by bringing consciousness to your experience rather than remaining unconscious of its deeper significance. Your wound doesn't exist in isolation. It's connected to a vast network of inherited pain that flows through family lines and what depth psychology calls the collective unconscious, the shared psychic space where all human experiences are held. The betrayal that shattered your trust connects to generations of betrayals in your family line. The abandonment that broke your heart links to ancestral patterns of leaving and being left. Unhealed wounds get passed down through families like genetic traits. The mother who was abandoned as a child unconsciously creates relationships where abandonment is likely. The patterns continue until someone has the consciousness and courage to break the cycle. When you truly forgive, when you break the cycle of unconscious retaliation in your own life, you're not just healing your personal wound, you're healing a pattern that has affected countless people across generations. This is why forgiveness work feels so important and so challenging. Your unconscious recognizes that you're not just making a personal choice, you're making a choice that affects the collective healing of humanity itself. The myths and stories that have survived across cultures contain maps for this transformation. The hero's path, the wounded healer, the phoenix rising from ashes. These are psychological templates that show how consciousness can emerge from suffering. Your individual forgiveness work becomes part of this larger story. You become a link in the chain of human consciousness evolution, someone who has taken inherited unconsciousness and transformed it into awareness. This gives your forgiveness work significance that transcends personal healing. You're contributing to the healing of collective patterns that have caused suffering for countless generations. If forgiving others is difficult, forgiving yourself can feel impossible. Self-forgiveness requires what Jung called moral courage, the willingness to see yourself clearly rather than maintaining comfortable illusions about your own goodness. The process begins with full acknowledgement of what you did, how it affected others, and what it reveals about your own unconscious patterns. This requires moving beyond the ego's natural tendency to minimize or justify harmful actions. Most people resist this because they confuse self-acknowledgement with self-attack. But Jung distinguished between healthy guilt, which motivates change, and neurotic guilt, which perpetuates unconsciousness. Healthy guilt says, I caused harm, and I need to understand why. Neurotic guilt says, I am a fundamentally bad person. The first leads to growth, the second leads to shame-based cycles. Understanding the unconscious patterns that led to harmful actions follows. Jung insisted that people don't hurt others from consciousness, they hurt from unconsciousness. This doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but it helps you understand the wounds and conditioning that influenced your choices. Often, harmful actions are unconscious attempts to meet legitimate needs or protect yourself from perceived threats. Understanding these patterns helps you develop what Jung called compassionate objectivity, seeing your patterns clearly without condemning or excusing them. Making amends where possible and changing harmful patterns requires what Jung called the sacrifice of the persona, giving up the image of yourself as someone who would never cause serious harm. This sacrifice is terrifying because it means living without the comfortable illusion of your own inherent goodness. It means accepting that consciousness is not a permanent achievement, but an ongoing practice. Integration eventually occurs, the point where you can hold both your capacity for harm and your capacity for healing without denying either. You become what Jung called a conscious participant in your own unconsciousness. People who have truly forgiven themselves become wounded healers, individuals whose personal experience with causing harm gives them wisdom to help others navigate their own shadow material. Forgiveness, when it's real, doesn't feel like letting someone off the hook. It feels like finally setting yourself free from a prison you didn't realize you'd been living in. Genuine forgiveness is a byproduct of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you were meant to be. When you're truly connected to your own path, other people's actions lose their power to define your reality. Real forgiveness has several distinctive qualities. It's unconditional. It doesn't depend on the other person changing or apologizing. It includes rather than excludes your authentic feelings. You can forgive someone while still feeling angry about what they did. Most importantly, forgiveness changes your relationship to the archetypal pattern that created the wound. You become immune to that particular form of unconsciousness. You can spot potential betrayers and naturally avoid creating relationships where betrayal is likely. This immunity isn't cynicism, it's wisdom. You see human nature clearly, including its capacity for both light and darkness, without becoming either idealistic or pessimistic. The ultimate goal of forgiveness work is developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously. You can understand someone's behavior without excusing it. You can love someone while protecting yourself from their unconscious patterns. When you reach this place, forgiveness becomes natural rather than effortful. You forgive because holding on to resentment no longer serves your growth. You let go because carrying old wounds interferes with your ability to be present to new possibilities. We've traveled through the complex landscape of forgiveness as depth psychology understands it, not as a moral obligation, but as a profound psychological process that transforms wounds into wisdom. This approach requires patience with your own process, the willingness to let forgiveness emerge in its own time, rather than forcing it according to external expectations. The forgiveness that emerges from this process is rooted in understanding rather than willpower, in integration rather than transcendence, in wholeness rather than goodness. When you forgive from this place, you're freeing yourself to become who you were meant to be. You're reclaiming energy that's been locked in old wounds and making it available for new creation. Your scars become sources of strength rather than shame. Your wounds become credentials rather than disqualifications. Your experience of darkness becomes light you can offer others still finding their way. The wound that brought you to explore forgiveness may never completely disappear, but it can be transformed from a source of unconscious suffering into conscious wisdom. Your forgiveness work is uniquely yours, but it's also part of a larger human story, how consciousness emerges from suffering, how meaning is forged from pain, how wisdom is extracted from wounds. Trust the process. Trust that your psyche knows what it's doing. Trust that forgiveness will come when you're ready, not when others think you should be. Thank you for staying with me through this exploration of forgiveness and the human psyche. If this resonated with you and helped you understand your own relationship with forgiveness in a new way, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Your support through likes, shares, and super thanks helps me continue creating content that dives deep into the complexities of human psychology and healing. And if you know someone who's struggling with forgiveness, whether of others or themselves, please consider sharing this with them. Until next time, be gentle with yourself and trust your own timing.